All right, folks, I have 12 noon on my clock here, so we'll get started with our September edition of the Forest Health Workshop. We're going to be picking up today where we left off in August with abiotic stress on trees. Today we'll be focusing primarily on herbicide damage to trees and how to manage such a tricky issue with our plants, our hardwoods. Our woody stemmed plants rather. Dr. John Ball is out of town today. He's planning to call in by the end of the hour. He did send me a recording of the presentation, so I'll share my screen here shortly and we'll start that presentation up. Please keep your video and your microphone muted and off in an effort to conserve bandwidth. CEUs for Society of American Foresters and International Society of Arborists certifications are available for attending this live workshop. Please make sure you put your credentials for whichever agency in the chat box before you leave today. Any questions you may have, also please direct to the chat box. If Dr. Ball is not able to join us at the end of this workshop, I'll make sure to save the questions for him and we'll make sure they get answered on next month's workshop. So with that, I will share my screen and we will begin Dr. Ball's presentation.
Speaking of fall, a poll by YouGov reveals that autumn is America's favorite season. To kick off many people's favorite time of year, Main Street Square has their annual Pumpkin Festival this weekend. For 14 years, the Great Downtown Pumpkin Festival has grown from just Main Street Square to now covering 6.
Anthony, we can't hear Dr. Ball.
Are you able to hear him now?
Nope.
No, brother. All right, well, thanks for the heads up. Let's see if we can figure out why we're not hearing him. For I am hearing him through my speakers. And you guys have heard nothing he has said so far.
Nope, nothing.
Oh boy. We tried this yesterday and it worked just fine.
There was sound for a few seconds, but it was not John Ball. It was some other
Yeah, I think it was another participant joining us.
Got it.
Don't want to do that. I'm going to pull it up again here and see if it works this way. Can you hear him at all?
No.
Oh, man. Maybe if I share sound, that will do it. All right, let's try one more time. We're going to start from the top. Dr. Ball is about 45 minutes, 49 minutes of presentation.
Specialist. But I also have the role
Can you
of
hear him
forest
now?
health specialist for the
Yeah.
South Dakota Department of Agriculture
All
and
right, thanks,
Natural
folks.
Resources. So essentially the tree guy, and to get a lot of questions on what's wrong with my tree. And that's exactly where we're going to start. Why are my trees dying? Get these questions all the time. And last episode, I went over some of the problems, and I'll go over a few more today. Well, you get this box. And you get this box, and it has these samples in it. And one of the things I want you to notice, if you look at this picture, is the leaves are curled here. And that always makes me suspect we're looking at herbicide. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, this sample's not going to do me a lot of good to determine herbicides or how much herbicide. And the reason being is the box was shipped, couple of leaves drying out. And by the way, that means the material is leaving those leaves. So when I get it, I might be able to look and say, well, I suspect this is a growth regulator herbicide, but it's really not a good sample to test with. And I'll show you that a little bit later on. But these are the sort of samples I get. And here's some of the sites I go to where you suspect herbicide. What I want you to notice is in the background, trees are green. Everything's looking pretty good, but on this one site, everything's defoliated. You take a look, common buckthorn, and that's a hard plant to kill. It's gone. The ash trees are gone, and this is not emerald ash borer. This was taken actually when the epidemic was fairly young in Sioux Falls, so that wasn't extending that far south yet in Sioux Falls. The paniculi hydrangeas are even looking bad, and when I got up closer and took a look at the rosettes of foliage. Well, these sort of symptoms makes me suspect, especially the pattern, that what we're looking at is a herbicide and probably a growth regulating herbicide. And obviously then we have to go to testing. And I collected the foliage on there, and guess what I found? A lot of dicamba, extremely high levels of dicamba. And that was what was damaging the plants. Now, some recovered, but many of them just flat out died. And here was another site. Now, what I want you to notice is look at the foliage on it. Very small, very almost strap-like. Well, again, that makes me suspect that what we're looking at is herbicide. And then the pattern was quite unusual in that when I looked, all the trees around the block, the entire block, but all the trees on the other side were fine. Well, you know what? Now we're going to go out and look at a herbicide, and sure enough, take a look at this one, picloram. That's a great tree killer. In fact, it's designed to kill trees, and this was an off-labeled use. You don't use them on ornamental turf. But what they were trying to do is get rid of a lot of weeds. Well, they got rid of the weeds, but they got rid of the trees as well. So let's take a look at herbicides for just a moment. Now, first of all, we have the contact herbicides. Those are herbicides that do not move in the plant. They damage what was there when they sprayed. Paraquat's a good example of that. You get out there, the foliage will all be dotted. I mean, plants could be dead, but it's a contact. It just stays there. But then we also have herbicides that are flow mobile. They're going to move up and down the plant because they're transmitted through the tissue that moves the food throughout the tree. And then we have xylem mobile herbicides. These are going to move up the plant again as the water's being taken up. Now, there's a lot of herbicides that have both characteristics. They are flow mobile and xylem mobile, but we have some that tend to be flow mobile. Picloram, again, is an example of that. Then we have a lot that are xylem mobile, and atrazine would be a good example of that herbicide. So when we take a look at these xylem ones, the movement is upward only, and the foliage tends to have the older leaves exhibit the symptoms first. So you're going to see this present on the older foliage. The newer foliage may not have any symptoms or will have the symptoms later. Whereas the flow mobile ones are going to move from source to sink. And these are going to occur on the new growth first. You're going to get stunted, distorted tissue. They may show up even within a day. And what you're looking at here is picloram on pines. And you'll notice all the terminals on that have that distortion. Those are the shoot tips that never really developed into needles. They just kind of went kind of crazy. Showed up fairly quickly. And it was fairly easy then with testing to be able to show that, yes, that tissue contained a lot of picloram in it, and that was the reason for the symptoms. And I want to point out why we can eyeball this and say, I suspect picloram, I suspect a growth regulating herbicide. The only way to know for certain is with testing. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Here's one that I had to look at this spring. Notice the pines here. All the pines had these tips that were curled and that the needles were much reduced. What we're looking at here is another growth regulator and herbicide, and this is dicamba. And it was dicamba drifting in on the shelter belt from a nearby field. Now, by the way, the field wasn't adjacent. Dicamba will move as a drift, but temperature inversions will allow it to be carried. And so you're not always able to say where it came from. You know, the applicator didn't use, or the landowner didn't use any in their particular area, but you can't say, well, yes, it all came from this farm or that application. With these inversions and the way sometimes it drifts, it's impossible to locate the source. Well, these growth regulators, herbicides are mostly synthetic auxins. In other words, that's what causes the plant to grow. Auxin is what causes the plant to say, okay, I'm going to put the shoot on, I'm going to keep these buds from expanding or allow them to expand. Many of these are going to move up through the xylem and the phloem. So a lot of these are mobile in both locations, and they act on meristematic tissue. So the symptoms typically present on the newest growth first. Symptoms on deciduous trees are kind of the twisting of the petioles, usually upwards, and a lot of tissue at the nodes. Notice that? You're getting these little rosettes or bunches. Now, what this tells you is most likely a plant growth regulator. Okay, a herbicide, one of those herbicides. Doesn't tell you which one. The only way we can do that is look at the symptoms a little bit more and also to go through and do testing. Curled petioles on lilacs. You see how those petioles are kind of curled? You're not going to get that from drought, which is often mimics herbicide injury. The plants curl and drop. But if I see curled petioles like this, that's quite often an application of a herbicide, 2,4-D in this case, another plant growth regulator. And look at this, dicamba injury on hackberry. You get this upward cupping of leaves. Literally, it describes it well, doesn't it? It really forms a cup. And again, to determine that it's dicamba, because other plant growth regulators will cause similar symptoms, and that you need to go through and do the testing, which we did in this case to determine what was causing it and the amount. Now, by the way, we do have insects that will mimic this. This is the foliage on an ash tree, the new foliage, because that's where aphids like to feed. And this is from the ash leaf curl aphid. And so if you find curled bunched leaves at the tip, that doesn't always mean that it's a herbicide. It just leads you to suspect that it may be. Well, look at this from drift exposure. Pin oak found 32 parts per billion of dicamba, 140 of 2,4-D. Now, That doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not. And the reason for that is it starts breaking down right after the application. So the farther out you actually test the foliage, the less you're going to find in these. And I'll mention it later on, but I'll mention it now. And that is, this is why most testing should be done within 30 days of the exposure. In other words, when the symptoms are first spotted. Beyond that, you might detect some herbicides in it, but not at any meaningful numbers. So the sooner, the better. If there is need to determine what herbicide is actually causing the problem. And look at this, dicambin 2,4-D. Now this is on a sycamore. That literally did form a cup. These can vaporize, and the vapors move very easily during warm weather. We've had a lot of 86 degrees plus. In fact, in the spring, when they were trying to burn down some fields, it was incredibly hot, and we started seeing damage. Why? Because the emerging foliage is the most sensitive. So those spring applications are where you're going to see a lot of this, because it's affecting the meristematic tissue that is now going out there forming the leaves. That same application done in late summer, the symptoms may not show up this year, but we have to remember at this time of year, some plants are still setting buds for next year, and we could damage the tissue in the bud. So we could get the symptoms of the exposure showing up next year from late summer, fall applications this year. So sometimes there's a little bit of a delayed effect as well. So some of our common plant growth regulating herbicides here. I'll mention the brand names here, not to pick on any particular ones or endorsement or criticize, but Milestone, Stinger, Banville, Tordon, Garlon, 2,4-D, which is sold under a number of different brand names. But these are all ones that are fairly common to South Dakota, and you'll see them used, but you'll also see damage from these from misapplications. Our biggest problem is actually root uptake. Now, yes, in our communities and in our windbreaks, we see a lot of drift. Most of that being 2,4-D, particularly 2,4-D in towns, people out there spraying for weeds on a hot summer day when that's not the best time to take care of weeds. And dicamba applications out there. And again, those can drift considerable distances. But one of the other problems that we see is root uptake. And that's usually the fault of the landowner that's actually out there applying a herbicide. So drifts can come from the landowner or from the homeowner out there spraying weeds in their own yard. For root uptake, yeah, that did happen right on that site. And here was a common one. I went out to look at these trees for the landowner who notices pine trees were dying. Now, this is the most manicured lawn you've ever seen. There wasn't a single weed in it. I mean, it was perfect and it was huge. And when I looked at those trees, and you'll notice the tips, got to look closely, but you'll notice those tips are curling. They're not forming the needles. It's kind of that thickened bud, if you will, or candle. And so when I looked at that, noticed it on the pines, and I said, have you been spraying? And the response is always just a little. Never had anyone tell me I've sprayed a lot. It's always I sprayed just a little. And I said, what'd you spray? And I said, well, I'm not really sure, but I have the jar or the can, the bottle, in the barn. So he was able to take me out and show me what had been applied. And this was one on the Grazon Next herbicides. And if you look at the label, it will say trees adjacent to or in treated areas can occasionally be affected by root uptake through movement into the soil. Do not apply within the root zone of desirable trees unless such damage can be tolerated, and use special precaution near roses and legumes such as locust, redbuds, mimosa, which we don't have in our state, and carragana, the common pea shrub. So a problem with this particular chemical is the fact that if you apply it and you apply it in the root zone, you may end up damaging the trees. And the problem is a lot of the labels say, well, you know, be cautious applying within the drip line. The drip line is the imaginary line coming down from the edge of the canopies. That's what the concern is quite often. But you know what? That doesn't define the root zone. And the problem is the application of these herbicides over the root zones. Now, the label did even add this: use outside the drip line if you're concerned about hackberries or ponderosa pines, for example, and these are ponderosa pines, and he didn't spray directly underneath the trees. The problem is the roots can extend out equal to a distance of the height of the tree. In other words, if you look at that tree, a lot of these trees were about 8 feet tall or so. Some were 10. That means the roots go out 8 to 10 feet from the tree. That's a radius. So the drip line is meaningless with a lot of these applications. What you're really looking at is you don't want to apply them anywhere over the root zone. And the root zone is equal to the tree height. And if you want to be conservative, call it 1.5 times the tree height. And that should be the limits of how close you get to applying a lot of these chemicals. Now, the other one is milestone, for example, as one, but you might want to read labels very carefully when they say use outside of the root zone. In other words, you don't want to be even close on this because of root uptake, not drip, but root uptake. Is stay away from trees that are legumes. And a lot of people don't know what trees are legumes. I've gone out to landowners and found that they sprayed the herbicide right underneath their coffee trees. And they didn't realize those trees were legumes. So the ones you got to be real careful with are black locust, honey locust, Kentucky coffee tree, redbud, and Siberian pea shrub. Those are all legumes. And if the label says be cautious about using it near legumes or leguminosi trees, these are the trees that they're talking about. And again, you want to stay way beyond that root zone, which again is equal to the tree's height. So if it's a 20-foot tall tree, those roots can go out at least 20 feet. And you may, like I said, you may want to say 1.5 times just to be cautious. So you're staying 30 feet away with your applications of herbicides. If they say be cautious with leguminosi trees. That really explains a lot of our plant growth regulating trees, herbicides, but we also have other herbicides, some that affect photosynthesis. So you get kind of yellowing, death of tissue. It kind of burns off the leaves, but this is kind of an interesting pattern here. This is atrazine on a linden here tree, a basswood tree. The symptoms really start on the margins of the oldest leaves and kind of move inwards. And I know it's kind of hard to see on this one, but if you look at those little leaves, the newest leaves, they're not really being affected. It was that older foliage that was showing most of the injury. And then we have these pigment inhibiting herbicides. Command is one. And literally, you can have foliage turn white. Now, by the way, there's other reasons for foliage turning white. So again, it gets back to testing. But the new growth won't have any of the green pigments, or may not. Now, Command, you'll often get, like you see here, a little bit of the vein still will be green. But the new tissue on some of the plants will just be, if it came out when the application was made, it'll just be as white as could be, almost a ghost plant. All right, well, what about samples? Here's a couple of rules. First one, do not send herbicide samples unless requested. The reason being is to go through and do the testing for herbicides is not inexpensive. It can cost $100 to $200, or minimum $50 to go do the testing. And we only have so much money budgeted for herbicide testing. And I might also add, the testing that we do is for diagnostics only. In other words, to determine if herbicides are responsible for the symptoms that are seen. If a landowner says, well, you know what, I need to find out because I think it's the person adjacent and I'm going to sue, do not provide us with samples. There you're going to have to hire a consultant who will collect samples and have them done at your expense. We do not get involved in lawsuits. And by the way, if someone says, well, I just need to know, and we go through and figure out the problem, and then you say, well, you know what, I need to sue someone about this, we're not going to give you the data. All right. Ours is diagnostic only. We do not get involved in disputes. If two parties say, well, you know what, these plants are damaged. We need to find out what caused it, how much of the chemical was in there, what it's worth. That's why we have private consultants. And I'd be more than happy to point people in a direction of someone they can hire. Again, a list to go out there and do that. But again, we do them for diagnostics. Well, this looks like herbicide, but the only way we'll know is if we do the testing. Now, the samples must be collected within 30 days of the exposure. In other words, this is not something to say, you know what, I think last spring that was dripped. We may not find anything by fall. And the other thing, the samples must be frozen after collection and then overnighted to SDSU. Quite frankly, it's a lot easier for us to come out and collect the samples, put them in a cooler as quick as we can, because what happens is these chemicals will metabolize. And we need to find out exactly how much is in there. And here's a good example that in June, after an application, 100% of the samples, we could detect dicamba. But by October, none. In other words, even though those leaves showed symptoms because they had been treated in the spring, the herbicide wasn't in there anymore. And so in August, we could say, you know what? A lot of the samples we're collecting out on your place do show that dicamba was in there, and based on the symptoms was dicamba. But the amount that we're still able to show is so small that the amount at this time would not show that it caused any damage. That's why 30 days is real critical. And the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources, which does do testing as well for the pesticide service area of it, and follows up on pesticide complaints. That's why they, as well as the surrounding states, will say, we need to get out there and collect the samples within 30 days. And if you hire a consultant, same thing. They need to come out there within 30 days. Do not delay. Do not do as often people do. Well, we'll wait till next year. Next year's too late. If you really need to know, and by really need to know, the issue is that you feel you've been wronged, and the application that damaged your plants was caused by an adjacent landowner, then that's where consultants are best used to go out there and take the samples relatively soon, figure out exactly how much of the chemical is in there, figure out the damages that are in there. And so that if you do end up in a lawsuit or you do need it for insurance, that you have all that information. Well, let's take a look a little bit more at weeds. First of all, fabric. One of our best ways to avoid weed problems in windbreaks is to get out there and utilize fabric. I'm a big fan of fabric as long as the fabric is still on top. Quite often what happens is we'll end up with soil over the fabric, and then we get weeds. And we do have to manage weeds. And this is not going to be how do we manage weeds. That'll be a separate segment probably next spring, but you really do have to do fairly good weed control if you're going to get good growth on these plants. And until we get canopy closure, till the plants get established, really get some height to them, weed control is really essential. And fabric's a good way to do it. Now, I looked at this one. You could barely find the plants anymore. They were so overgrown, and the soil was getting on top of the fabric. Weeds can start on top of fabric if you've got soil there. But some of them are still pushing through. Well, we have pre-emergent herbicides out there. These are ones that kill the germinating seed out there. And they're good products to use. Again, we'll cover this all in another segment of how we do weed control, but Treflin, Snapshot, and then we have post-plant. And the only reason I'm mentioning this today is a lot of these post-planting ones will tell you when you should apply it afterwards. Some will say 4 weeks after transplanting. In other words, we've got pre-plant herbicides, Treflin, for example, Snapshot, that you can put down and plant. But then post-planting, all right, some of these, I'm going to put them around the hole or something like that for the fabric. Some of these would be 4 weeks after transplanting. So I'm using this just as an example. Don't take this as what I necessarily want to use. We'll have an entirely different segment just on that. And this is a good point to remind you, always read and follow label instructions. They're the final authority and the law. In other words, when and how to apply something, always refer back to the label. Well, let's go over some other problems with herbicides when you're out there putting shelter belts. And this is really a shelter belt issue. And I went out and looked at these, and all the cedars were dying. Every one of them. And they had already planted them once before. In other words, they planted all the cedars last year. They all died. The next year, they replanted them, and they all died. Now, interesting enough, some of the hardwoods, some of the cherries were doing fine, but I looked at them and I go, what was this the year before? In other words, 2 years ago. Well, I said it was corn. I said, well, was atrazine used? Well, yeah, they used it in the summer. I said, well, let me sample. I could still pull atrazine out of these 2 years later. That's why they were losing these plants. Every one of them was fried. Roots were dead, tops were dead. So one of the other things we have to look at is when you're establishing a shelter belt, what was in it the year before you established the shelter belt? So now we're not looking at weed control for the shelter belt. We're looking at what was used for weed control the year before. And we do have carryover concerns that, we get some of these products here. You might have to wait 2 years to plant. Atrazine, 2 years to plant. Now, some of these others, no, they're not a problem. And of course, some of these others, the surfactants, that not an issue at all in that. But you really do need to look at what was used. So let's go through it. If it was soybeans, well, here's some common chemicals used for soybean. And what I have here is the years to wait. In other words, if dicamba was used in 2022, you can usually safely plant in 2023. Now, dicamba doesn't last that long in the soil, and so you might even get away a little sooner than that. But this is being conservative. Command 1 to 2 years, depending on the soil. First rate, 3 years. Pursuit, 3 to 4 years. It can be 40 months beforehand. Now, you can check it after 3 years. You can do what we call a test planting and see how they survive. And I won't tell you that every time you have to wait absolutely 3 years, but you might want to consider this. What was in the field? It was soybeans. What did they use? And it gives you an idea of how long you may have to wait. And it might be divided by plants. Some plants, legumes, you might have to wait a little longer than some others. Conifers, you might have to wait a little bit longer than deciduous trees. But again, this gives you some kind of conservative estimate of how long to be able to go out there and go out there planting seedlings. Corn, atrazine, 2 years. Lightning, that might be 3 to 4 years. Again, we're looking rather conservative here, Lee, again. But it gives you some idea of the outside time that you might have to wait in order to go in there and plant. It's kind of important that, someone's saying, well, I might turn this ground over into a windbreak at some point. Well, okay, well, you may want to watch what you're using for herbicides for the next 2 or 3 years before you're going to go out there and actually plant it. Wheat and sorghum, alley, again, another 2 to 3 years that you may end up having to wait. And for pastures, milestone, maybe 2 years, and that would be for legumes. Milestone, 1 year is usually going to be fine. Grazon, Tordon, your picloram products, it can be 3 years before you're really able. Now, again, doesn't mean all plants. Check the label. That'll give you some information as well. But my point is, you can't just go out there and plant the following year without knowing what herbicides were applied. And you may want to go out there and wait. Like I said, that atrazine one, year afterwards, they went out and planted the trees. All the conifers died, so they replanted them again, and all the conifers died. And that was what I was able to pull up was atrazine out of those plants. Well, what other issues do we have out there? And this is kind of related to windbreaks, but we do have, obviously, problems with our soils, that our soils, because of the high pH, are going to lack sometimes available iron and manganese. Now, that is a problem we have in urban areas as well. The biggest thing is make sure you're choosing plants that can tolerate the pH in which they're being planted. That almost goes without saying, but it's a real common problem. We see river birch turning yellow right now in Sioux Falls because of the lack of iron, because of the high pH soils, for example. And we do see that on oaks, and on maples. It can be manganese or iron, and we can even see it on plum in high pH soils. But the other one that I want to mention, a soil problem related to windbreaks, is old feedlots. It's amazing the salt injury we can get on old feedlots, that if you go out there and test it, you're going to find some fairly high salt levels. And I've actually gone out on some shelter belts, young trees, and you'll walk along and they're all doing fine, and then suddenly they're not. And I'll ask, what was here? And you can kind of look around and get an idea. Well, yeah, this was our feedlot. You should have checked the soils before you planted. You should have checked the salt levels. And either planted a cover crop to absorb some of that, or you're going to have to get it leached out, because spruce, for example, are very sensitive to salt levels. Dogwoods are another plant that I frequently see injured because they will not tolerate fairly high salt levels, particularly as seedlings. And remember, that's what you're establishing. The most sensitive, cottonwoods, Cotoneaster, dogwoods, as already mentioned, lindens, poplars, spruce. The least sensitive, in other words, can take fairly high salt levels, ash, which nobody's planting because of emerald ash borer, of course, buffalo berry, choke cherries, and choke cherries can take quite a bit, elms, lilacs, ponderosa pines, not all pines, ponderosa, and sea buckthorn, a plant that is occasionally used out there. So the real thing is go out there. If they say, well, we've got a feedlot here, or you suspect it, make sure that you've gone through and done a soil test before you go out there and establish the plants. Lack of irrigation. By the way, lack of water has been a big problem throughout the state this year. We're still in a drought, as we were last year. But in shelter belts, that can be a particular problem. You know, I get out there and I take a look at a lot of these small trees that have died this year. Some have not had meaningful rain. Some areas have not had meaningful rain for several months, and the roots are dead. I mean, the roots are dead, so the top died. They were not able to absorb a sufficient amount of water. And this is what I want to see when I pull up those young seedlings right now. I want to see fairly long new growth. Now, with our heat, that's going to reduce root growth as well. But I still should be seeing this at this time of year. And there's a lot of trees I'm not, because they've not had adequate water. And it's just been too darn hot. The soils are essentially baking. Well, I took this picture. This is in Turner County several years ago, that last major drought we had. And you can take a look, and the trees weren't doing well at all. And add a pint of water to each seedling at planting, and then every day for 2 weeks. I know that's a lot of work, but if we're not going to get any real measurable rains and the ground is already dry, the only way you're going to get those trees to establish at all is if you water them at planting. I know it's tough to do, and then water them every day for 2 weeks. And by the way, when I go out and talk to landowners, say, well, I can't water them. Can I fertilize them instead? No, fertilizer is not a substitute for watering. It has to be water. And what was interesting is they found this out. This is a Tree Planter's Notes, an excellent publication for windbreak issues. But notice this, adding 16 fluid ounces of water at planting increased growth 30% and reduced mortality by 25%. Water is essential. And watering them at planting is critical to the long-term success of those trees. And I like it when I get out and see landowners have gone through and done this, as they have here, a trickle irrigation system, and those trees were doing incredible. And even this one, look at this one. Drought, you can see the grasses are browning out, but man, all the trees look great. Every plant out there got 2 gallons an hour for 12 hours. In other words, every plant, you can see the irrigation, got 24 gallons a week during this drought. And they looked beautiful. The surrounding grass, not too nice, but the trees and shrubs, perfect. Why? Because the landowner invested in watering them. And I know it's not always possible or practical, but when it can be done, it makes an incredible difference. The other thing, though, is take a look at your water quality. More of an issue West River than East River. But we do have people that have sent in water samples for their wells, for example, and ask, can I use this? And if you take a look, obviously we want a fairly low salt level. And if you take a look at the chart here, once you start getting up above 0.75, better be a salt tolerant tree and shrub. And if it's very high, it's not recommended at all. And particularly if you're starting to look at seedlings going in, you really want that on fairly low salt levels, not high at all. And what about the fabric? I already mentioned you really do need fabric for weed control, or it's probably one of the better ways of doing it. You don't want to over-till, you're losing moisture when you do that. And fabric does make a big difference. I mean, if you take a look at the growth here, a particular study here, they got a lot more growth. Now, this is cottonwood, and they were really establishing fast. But bare soil was fantastic. Well, you probably aren't going to do bare soil, so you're probably going to use fabric to try to get around that. And fabric is good, but do keep in mind those temperatures. That fabric, that black fabric, it's going to bake the plants right above there. So we're going to get thin bark trees. We can get some damage. And if you're going to pull them up through the fabric, make sure you do it within 5 minutes. I've actually seen some damage where the trees weren't pulled up quick enough, and they baked underneath the fabric before they were pulled up. Look at this one. Here's the one where the piece of fabric was actually leaning up against the shrubs. It was baking them. Those temperatures can reach 110 degrees on that fabric. How many people would like to lie down on fabric on a hot summer day? I don't think anybody would. And so while fabric can be beneficial, it can be detrimental if it actually is attached to the tree or shrub, because it's going to warm up that soil right around there for that little seedling. It's going to warm up the air. And if the fabric's actually touching the plant, so much the worst. And make sure you've cut the fabric large enough. I mean, this was literally a punch hole. You're not going to be able to get trees to expand very well out of these fabrics. You know, on our deciduous trees, there's usually enough sunlight getting down there that they will break down over time. It'll tear, but not so with our conifers. You can go into, that's all fabric, believe it or not, underneath those cedars there. And some of the cedars weren't doing very well, and they were in about 12 years. And that's an important number to remember. It seems like it takes about 10 to 12 years before you start seeing fabric girdling them. But you dig underneath them, the fabric was embedded in the trunk of these 8-year-old cedars. You couldn't even pull it out under some of them. It was embedded in the trunks because as the tree was expanding, the fabric was not, nor was the fabric tearing. And it was covered up because you've got that dense cover of cedar. That's why we plant cedars. You get a little soil mixing in there now too. And that fabric looked as good as the day it went in, except now it was in the trees rather than just surrounding the trees. And here's some 12-year-old cedars, same thing. They were being girdled by the fabric. It was literally touching the trunks and embedded in the trunks, so cutting off the water movement. And here's 12-year-old ponderosa pine. So fairly common problem with cedars. I see it with spruce. I see it with pine as well, because the ground's so well protected, the fabric doesn't break down at all. And, you know, here's a good example. You're starting to see some of the pines dying. Got underneath there, had to pull the soil away. The fabric was covered by about an inch, and you could not pull that fabric out from that at all. So what do? Well, every 5 years you make relief cuts with a box cutter on 2 sides. I don't think anybody wants to do that. It's a common recommendation, but crawling under a cedar belt, especially West River with the rattlers, is not something I'd look forward to doing. Best thing is take care of the problem when you put the fabric in and make the hole properly there. And better is just plan on removing the fabric in year 5 or 6. Now, by the way, it's remove it in 5 or 6. Don't wait till 10 or 12. Reason for that is by that time, the root system of those trees are up near the surface. Why? Because now you got an inch or 2 of soil above the fabric. You pull the fabric away then, particularly during a drought year, you'll end up killing the trees because the roots are far too shallow. But removing fabric in year 5 or 6, once you've got a little canopy cover up there, a little closure, At that point, you can pull it away. And then again, also be careful how you're putting the fabric in. Make a J or an L. Don't just make a small little slit as was often done. We need something that's going to account for the expansion of that plant. Now, again, you are going to probably end up using herbicides in there. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of weeds coming up, and we'll discuss that in a later episode. But if you really want to use fabric, make sure you make a big enough cut, J or L shaped, so that thing can continue to expand, as you see here on a hardwood. Well, we also get more fabric problems, and that is sometimes people don't pull them up through. And as you saw on this one, they ended up dying through there. You got to pull them through the fabric, especially, again, within 5 minutes on years that are hot. And you better put them in the soil properly as well. Well, let's take a look at some insect and critter problems that we have. And I do want to mention this one, this bullet oak gall wasp. And it's become enough of a problem that we're seeing people avoiding planting bur oaks, both in town and in windbreaks. This little wasp, and again, the wasp is not going to affect you, but what it does is it forms these galls on the tree. Well, that in itself is not a big problem. But the woodpeckers really like the insect, and they'll shred the bark off of bur oak. I think the worst problem I see is up in the northeastern part of our state. You go up in the Aberdeen area, and you'll see small trees that have almost all of their bark shredded off because the woodpecker's frantically looking for this little grub, if you will, that's just beneath the bark. So here's an interesting problem where the gall insect itself is not causing a tremendous amount of damage to the plant, but the bird seeking it is causing the damage. Again, to the point that there are some people that are just saying, I'm not planting oak. Now, bur oak seems to be a problem with that just because of the damage. And in some areas, we see it all the time, and in some areas, we don't. So if it's prevalent in your area, it's just probably an issue you're going to avoid, or you're going to have to treat it so you're killing these so they don't attract the birds. But I mean, look at this in town. All that's done by the woodpeckers looking for that little wasp. All right, well, what other critter problems do we have? Deer. Bambi's a problem. And out there in our shelter belts and that, we see a lot of it. We do see it in town too. We have a lot of urbanized deer, but you can see here where they've gone through on these cherries and nipped them all off and made them more of a shrub. Deer will go after pines. They don't go after spruce that much, but they will. A lot of people have seen that damage. We can see here where they nipped off the tips of every one of those needles. And here on spruce, that's a established Myers spruce that the deer browse every year, essentially turning it into a beach ball. Myers spruce has softer needles. I love the tree, but it has much softer needles than the Colorado spruce, so the deer really seem to like it. And take a look at this planting here. Do you see the oaks? Those oaks aren't doing very well, are they? Why? Tremendous deer pressure. You're looking at 5-year-old oaks, and that's as big as they've got because the deer browse them down that much. Deer love oak. They love hackberry too. And in this shelter belt, everything was chewed down that much. So what do you use? Use tree tubes. And it was interesting. Half the rows, the producer used tree tubes, and the other half didn't, of course. And so the part that they didn't, the hackberries and the oaks, were only about an inch or two tall. They were essentially shrubs or ground covers. But where tubes were used, they did much better. Except, it was interesting. The height of the tube's important as well. The 4-foot tubes, the deer could still reach the top very easily. And they just browsed the top of them. So you had this tube where the trees had pushed up in the 5 years. And at the top were being heavily browsed. And so on those tubes, which are really so nice, you're just getting them heavily browsed. But the 5-foot tubes, the trees were coming out and doing fine. And that, so don't go too short on the tubes as well. And remember, tubes were really first produced to avoid deer pressure. And I've become a big fan of tubes where you're planting them in areas where there is a tremendous amount of deer pressure, which is essentially the state of South Dakota. But you can see the 4-foot tubes there. Essentially, that was deer candy. You were holding them up at just the point they could nibble on them. But on the 5-foot tubes, that seemed to be high enough, in this case at least, that once the tree started coming out of the tubes, you can see that that growth was pretty normal, where you just go down the road just a little bit more, shorter tubes, and then where they had no tubes, you're getting very stunted trees. So tubes work. And by the way, if you're using tubes, don't pull the tubes off too early. The tree is going to take a little time to gain its strength so it stands up. Remember, in that tube, it's not subjected to the winds as much. So I see it where people pull the tubes off and all the trees just lay down. Leave them until they're above the tubes by a considerable amount. In fact, some will say leave them in until the trunk's almost touching them. You don't have to go quite that far, but you do want that canopy above the tubes sufficient enough that the tree is now swaying a little bit with the wind, and that's strengthening the trunk of the tree. Do not remove tubes too early. Rabbits, yeah, we see damage with them too. They'll nibble on quite a bit. You can see here in this belt how they've gone through and girdled it. There are a lot of sprays that will work for rabbits. They work better when you apply it when you first see the damage than if you try to go into a belt that they've gone into for several years. The ones that work by odor, taste, seem to work fairly well. Sometimes one will work one year and not the next. So you often alternate to it. Ones that smell like predators and that sometimes work too. But I will say, if you take a look, rotten eggs smell seems to work fairly well, but it doesn't always work. And one product 1 year will work for you, and the next year it won't. So don't be disappointed. Try a variety of products. Don't expect something that's worked for the last couple of years may work the next, but obviously you're going to try it. And then squirrels, the squirrel damage we're seeing this year is incredible. In the spring, they were gnawing entire branches off elm trees like this. And right now, if you go out, and this is in urban areas too, I took this on campus, look at that. We're getting some branches on the hackberries that are turning all this nice yellow a little too early. And if you trace back those branches, the darn squirrels have girdled them. They've chewed the bark completely around those branches, and that branch is now going to die. Now, sometimes you'll see where they've only chewed part of the branch, and maybe a few leaves will turn yellow when they come back the following year. But other times, what you'll see is this: they girdle the entire branch, and they seem to have their favorite trees. I mean, some taste better than others, apparently. Some are a little sweeter. And then finally, voles. That's a shelter belt problem. And I've gone out and looked at a lot of cedar belts where you're looking at stems dying, and you go underneath there, and guess what? They've girdled them. So a reminder, if you can mow the grasses between the belts tight this fall, so you don't have as much hiding cover for the voles, that's going to go a long way to reducing the problem. And if you have to, those bait boxes will work as well. And I prefer the boxes rather than just applying the roticide, because then you might end up killing non-target critters as well. But yeah, these are become a real serious problem in a lot of our shelter belts, particularly some of the West River ones. I've seen more problems than not. And I've seen it out in a lot of plantings like this one. All the trees were turning, and if you look, there they were girdled. Well, thank you for watching this. I hope that answered a few more questions for you out there. Again, I can be reached at john.ball@sdstate.edu. If you have any questions, now we'll typically have Tony get your questions to me, and I'll provide you with some answers. So thanks a lot for watching.
And there he is, Dr. Ball. You joined us. Thank you.
You bet. Glad to be here, Tony.
So we had a bit of a hiccup to start where we got that fixed and we made it through the presentation just fine. I see one question right away. Anybody who is on the call and has any questions for Dr. Ball, now's the time to add it in the chat. We'll start with the first level. What are high levels that you would guess would be in the parts per million?
All right, and that's a good question. There hasn't been a lot of work done, but we do have some that shows the amount. Quite often, and it varies with the chemical, but for some, we've shown as high as 1,100 or 900 parts per billion. These are often measured in rather than millions, but we do both. And on those, what we're getting, I remember it was called threesome. It's a chemical with dicamba and then also 2,4-D in that in it, as well as some others. And on some spruce, where it was be used in an off application, it should not have been used there. It's not an urban chemical. We're pulling out 1,000 parts per billion, and the spruce were fried. I mean, they were just gone. Other times, it's only 300 or 30 even. And this is an important point, Tony, in that if you test within 30 days of application on a number of these chemicals, you'll be able to show that, well, we're pulling off 500, let's say, or we're pulling out 30. But we can check a chart that says if you have more than 500, if you have more than whatever the particular chemical is, that will cause damage. Now, remember, if we tested it 6 months later, we might only get one. And with that one, someone will say, well, it couldn't have possibly caused damage. No, it breaks down that quickly. And that's
Dr. Ball, you still with us? Yeah, it looks like we lost him. Give him a moment here to rejoin the call. Hopefully he can finish that thought. And I'm looking at the chat box. I know we got a couple more questions here. Lori, I do not know the answer to how to lower high salts in the soils. We'll have to leave that one for Dr. Ball. Amanda, I believe the legume trees are simply more just more sensitive to the different chemicals. And Dr. Ball will probably have a more specific answer for you with that. Well, we have 2 more minutes before the hour.
Hey, Tony, why are they more sensitive?
That's I'll leave that answer for Dr. Ball.
Okay.
Jody, these recordings are posted online. We've had a bit of a delay with the part 1 video. There's been some technical issues downloading the video. So we're working on that, hoping to get parts 1 and 2 up here shortly. Ivy, let me see the salt tolerance slide for you. I'll pull that up here shortly. Would this happen to be the slide you're referring to? Oh, we want the trees that are more tolerant. I'm working off of a recorded video, so it's a little tricky for me to find specific slides. You know, that'll be something I'll add to Dr. Ball's list. Oh, it looks like Amanda got it. Ivy, I'd encourage you to look back at the chat box. Thanks, Amanda. Lindsay, I'll try and do my best to get this PowerPoint accessible. At the very least, this video should be posted here shortly and can be used as a reference as well. But I'll talk with Dr. Ball and hopefully we can get that presentation posted to our website for everybody to look at. Herbicides can be very tricky, folks. Timing, you know, quick action is best for us to have to know good results when it comes to herbicide damage. So if you do suspect there might be some chemical issues with your trees, acting quick is the best bet for saving any trees or learn or how to mitigate the issue moving forward. Jody, this video will be put on that same YouTube channel, the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources YouTube channel. We try and post all our videos up there. And then we put those links to the YouTube video on our website, which is the website that you're linked to in our flyers. Well, I'm past 1 o'clock here. Thank you so much, folks, for your patience, for hanging with us through those technical errors. We're working hard to get past videos up online and get all the credentials submitted. Look forward to our presentation in November. Topic TBD. Talk to Dr. Ball and we'll get that flyer out shortly. So thanks, folks. Have a great rest of your day.